Welcome to the Silent Room. This is a place for cinematic audio stories. Stories meant to be listened to in the dark, with the lights low and the world quiet. Every week, you'll hear a new story. Psychological, mysterious, and unsettling in ways that stay with you. If this is your first time here, welcome. Now, let's begin. Blackwood did not look like a town in the grip of the 19th century. It looked like a sovereign kingdom that had bribed the years to pass it by. Anchored 3 miles off the rugged coast, the island was a near-perfect circle of rock rising from the iron-grey Atlantic. Its only connection to the mainland was the umbilicus, a narrow stone bridge, a mile long, that held this floating world from drifting into the abyss. In 1840, while the rest of the country buried its children in shallow, famine-stricken graves, Blackwood flourished. From a distance, it was a miracle of smoke and gold. Up close, it was a specimen under glass. Julian Morcant arrived with a leather satchel and the sharp, clinical eyes of an expert. He was an archivist, a man who spent his life picking up stray fields of study like discarded coins, botany, chemistry, and complex bookkeeping. He wasn't just a clerk, he was a specialist in order. The summons had reached Julian in a dusty London boarding house, offering a staggering sum of money for a very specific task, a centennial consolidation. To the audience, the reason for Julian's presence is simple. Blackwood has spent the last century expanding its mills, its foundries, and its clinics at a frantic pace. However, their records are a mess, fragmented, chaotic, and unverified. To move into the next 100 years of success, the town needs a master index. They need a single, undeniable volume that proves every ounce of iron produced, and every acre of land owned is accounted for. They couldn't use a local. A local might be biased or overlook mistakes. They needed a clean witness, an outsider with the potential to retrieve a century of data and distill it into a single book, the Century Ledger. At the community house, located at the island's exact center, Julian met Rector Halloway. The man was a masterpiece of controlled grace. "Mr. Morcant," Halloway said, his voice a low melodic hum. "Blackwood is a closed system. We have achieved much, but our memory is scattered. We need you to gather the threads of the last 100 years and weave them into this ledger. Your signature at the end will be the seal, the proof to the world that our debts are settled and our achievements are real." Julian looked at the massive brass-bound book on the desk. To him, it wasn't a conspiracy. It was the ultimate challenge. He was the only man with the potential to turn a century of chaotic life into a perfect, organized proof of success. He moved into the stone lodge on the cemetery's edge, dipped his pen, and began to write. He was a man of logic, and the logic was simple. He was being paid a fortune to be the island's memory. He didn't realize that in Blackwood, memory was a heavy burden, and they had no intention of letting him carry it back across the bridge. By the time Friday evening arrived, Julian's neck was stiff from the sheer weight of the data he had already processed. His quarters were located in a small, sturdy stone outhouse, a secondary building sitting on the same plot as the Grand Community Hall. This hall sat at the exact geographic center of the circular island, and as Julian walked the short distance from his door to the gathering, he felt the strange rhythmic pull of the island's geometry. Inside the community hall, The air was thick with the scent of roasted meats and sweet wine. The townspeople were gathered in their best clothes, their faces glowing with a health that seemed too perfect to be natural. As Julian entered, he was met with a wave of genuine, quiet warmth. He wasn't hailed as a hero, but rather welcomed as a long-awaited guest. Families stepped forward to introduce themselves, offering firm handshakes and soft smiles. "A pleasure to have you here, Mr. Morcant," a man said, handing him a glass of dark cider. "I am Thomas, a baker from the Northern District. We've all been eager to see the man who will help put our history into words." Julian nodded, making polite conversation. However, as the night went on and he moved through the crowd, a strange pattern began to emerge in the talk. He spoke with a woman from the Western Docks and a young man from the Southern Foundries. And through their casual remarks, Julian heard the same unsettling news. "It's a lovely night," the woman whispered, looking around the hall. "Though it's a shame the Western magistrate couldn't be here. A sudden heart failure, they say, just 2 weeks ago. Such a pillar of the community, gone so fast." Later, near the refreshment table, the young man from the south sighed. "The forge feels quiet lately. We lost the head smith last month. A forge accident, apparently. He was an outsider like yourself, came here 10 years ago. It's been a heavy season for us." Julian began to listen more closely. From the north, he heard of a miller who had passed in his sleep amidst the harvest. From the east, a healer who had succumbed to a sudden fever despite her own medicines. These mentions were brief, spoken with a sad but quiet acceptance, as if deaths in these 4 cardinal corners were simply a part of the island's rhythm. Julian didn't crack the code yet. He just noted it as a series of tragic coincidences in a town that otherwise seemed perfect. Seeking a moment to process these whispers, Julian stepped toward the far end of the hall, near the shadowed exit that led back toward his outhouse. There, leaning against a dark wooden pillar in the dim light, stood a man who looked like a jagged crack in a perfect mirror. He was covered in the grey dust of the earth, and he smelled of cheap, biting gin. This was Barnaby, the town's gravekeep. Julian, wanting to remain kind despite the man's dishevelled appearance, stepped forward. "Good evening. Barnaby, isn't it? I'm Julian Morcant. I believe I'm your neighbour at the centre of the island." Barnaby didn't move. He didn't even look Julian in the eye. He just stared at the floor, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across stone. "The clerk," Barnaby rasped, loud enough only for Julian to hear. "The one they brought in to polish the bones." Julian paused, confused. "I'm here to archive the island's history, Barnaby. I'm here to record the progress you've all made." Barnaby finally looked up. His eyes were bloodshot and filled with a cold, bitter intelligence. "Lambs always love the butcher," he whispered, "as long as the knife is hidden in a velvet sleeve." Before Julian could respond, Barnaby stumbled out the door and into the night. Julian turned back to the golden light of the hall. The people were still talking, the cider was still being poured, and the rector was nodding kindly from across the room. But the mentions of the 4 recent deaths now felt like heavy weights in Julian's mind, and the velvet warmth of the hall suddenly felt very, very thin. As the weeks turned, the warmth of the Friday gathering felt like a distant memory. Winter didn't just arrive in Blackwood, it seemed to settle into the very stones of the island. A A damp, bone-deep chill filled Julian's outhouse, and the air grew heavy with the scent of bitter almonds, a smell he initially mistook for the expensive wood oils used in the community hall. Julian's health began to mirror the dying season. His lungs felt as though they were being lined with fine glass, and his fingertips had taken on a translucent, jaundiced yellow hue. He blamed the freezing drafts and the grueling hours he spent hunched over the ledger, but his body felt like it was slowing down, becoming as waxy and stiff as the vellum pages he turned. One evening, while prying at a loose floorboard to steady his shaking desk, Julian discovered a bundle wrapped in heavy oil-stained cloth. Inside was the shadow diary of Thorn, the Archivist from 1740. As Julian read Thorn's jagged handwriting, the tragic accidents he had heard about at the community hall stopped being coincidences. They were a tradition. Thorn had documented a brutal logic passed down by the island's forefathers, the tithe of progress. The town believed that for Blackwood to stay a paradise, it had to constantly import the future from the mainland. Every century, the town would lure 5 talented outsiders to the island, specialists who brought the newest advancements in industry, medicine, and law. These were the 5 pillars. Julian read Thorn's account of the previous cycle with mounting horror. The town didn't just hire these outsiders, they drained them. Julian read of the smith at the Southern Forge, the pillar of strength. He had been lured from the mainland to install the island's massive steam furnaces, but once the local apprentices had mastered the pressure valves and the pour, the smith was found on his own forge floor. His jaw had been shattered by a snapping iron rod, a gruesome accident the town elders called strength returned to the iron. To the east, the pillar of growth had met a similar fate. She was a healer who had brought the secret of new vaccines to the island's clinic. She spent months teaching the locals how to balance tinctures and distill cures, but as soon as her recipes were safely recorded in the town's private volumes, she was found dead in her dispensary. She had been suffocated by the very medicinal fumes she had used to save the lives of the townspeople. Even the simple act of providing food was stained with blood. Thorn wrote of the miller at the northern silos, the pillar of provision. He had successfully automated the grain lifts, ensuring the island would never go hungry. But during the height of the harvest, he was lost in a grain collapse, buried alive under the weight of the very golden wheat he had helped them store. Finally, there was the lawman in the west, the pillar of order. He was a magistrate brought in to rewrite the island's ancient charters and create laws that would shield their wealth from the outside world. His reward for establishing the town's court was to be found swinging from the bell rope of his own courthouse, a suicide that ensured no one would ever question the legality of the town's traditions. The book describes the final pillar, the pillar of memory, but no much information about it. The damp chill in the outhouse grew heavier as Julian turned the brittle pages of Thorn's diary. The entries weren't just a list. They were a roadmap of the island's cold, calculated cruelty. Thorn had been the archivist of 1740, the man who sat in this very chair exactly 100 years ago. Julian's heart hammered against his ribs as he flipped to the final jagged entry. It wasn't a conclusion, it was a scream cut short. A quick search of the town's burial records confirmed his dread. Thorn had been found dead at his desk on the very night the ledger was completed. Terror, cold, and absolute washed over Julian. He looked at his jaundiced, waxy fingers, the hands of a man already halfway to the grave. He was the current pillar of memory, and the realization that he was a walking corpse scheduled for disposal sent him into a frantic, desperate sweat. But as the panic peaked, his analytical mind, the very thing the rector had hired him for, kicked into gear. He wouldn't simply wait for the scythe. He began a feverish investigation of the small outhouse. He tore at the wood of the bed frame, sniffing for toxic resins. He knelt by the fireplace, tasting the ash to see if they were burning hemlock or nightshade to poison the air. He checked the water pitcher for lead and the lamp oil for arsenic. Nothing. Finally, his eyes fell back onto the century ledger. He noticed a faint, shimmering residue on the edges of the glossy vellum, a slight discoloration that only appeared where his thumb had pressed to turn the pages. He leaned in, taking a shallow, cautious breath. There it was, the sweet, unmistakable scent of bitter almonds. The vellum had been treated with a concentrated cyanide paste. Every time he licked his thumb to flip a page, a habit of a lifetime of clerical work, he had been dosing himself with his own execution. The fear in his gut didn't vanish, but it transformed into a sharp, cold clarity. He was being killed by the very history he was writing. With a trembling hand, Julian grabbed a pair of heavy leather gloves and shoved the ledger to the far corner of the desk. He would not touch another page with his bare skin. He was the one who recorded the data, and now he had the most important data of all. He knew how they were doing it. Julian stood in the center of the dark room, his breath rattling in his chest. He was dying, but he wasn't dead yet. He looked out the window toward the graveyard where Thorn was buried, and then further out toward the dim light of Barnaby's shack. The town thought they had hired a victim, but they had accidentally hired an auditor, and Julian was about to settle the accounts. Julian knew there was only one person on this rock capable of helping him dismantle a century of lies, the man who lived among the dead. He moved through the freezing mist toward the shack at the cemetery's edge. Every breath was a struggle, but Julian's mind remained a sharp, cold blade. He found Barnaby slumped over his table, staring at a half-empty bottle. Julian didn't knock. He stepped into the dim light and placed a trembling hand on the gravekeep's shoulder. "Your grandfather didn't die in an accident, Barnaby," Julian whispered. "He was the smith of 1780. He was brought here to build the fires that keep this island rich, and when he was done, they broke his jaw to keep him silent." Barnaby's bloodshot eyes flickered with a mix of confusion and irritation. He pulled away, his voice a gravelly rasp. "How could you possibly know that? You've been here a month. That's 100 years of dust you're digging up." Julian leaned forward, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. "I am an archivist because I have a curse, Barnaby, a near-perfect memory for data. I don't just read names, I see the threads between them. I saw the surname Blacksmith in the records of the 1700s, and I saw how it was shortened to Black when your mother was born. I saw your family's signature on the forged deeds and compared it to the mark you make on the cemetery logs. You are the grandson of the man who built the South Foundries, and the town has spent 40 years trying to make you forget it." The fog of alcohol seemed to evaporate from Barnaby's mind. He went deathly still, his large hands gripping the edge of the table. "My mother was right," he breathed, his voice breaking. She used to scream about the secrets of the town, but people called her mad. When she died, I was only 19. She was the first person I ever buried. I remember the rector standing over the hole, handing me a bottle of gin and telling me it would dull the grief. I thought they were being kind. I didn't realize they were just feeding me the silence. They weren't dulling your grief, Barnaby. They were dulling your memory, Julian said, slamming the shadow diary onto the wood. They're doing it again. They're killing me with poisoning the pages, and once I'm gone, you'll be the one to lower me into the dirt, just like you did for the others. The rage that replaced Barnaby's stupor was ancient and terrifying. He stood up, towering over Julian. "We aren't the only ones left," Julian said, pointing to the map. "The miller's daughter, the healer's kin, they are the loose threads. The town kept them at the edges because they were never meant to be part of the future. They were meant to be the next generation of victims." In the flickering candlelight of the shack, the plan was born. Barnaby, finally sober and fueled by a lifetime of suppressed fury, led Julian through the secret paths of the island. One by one, they gathered the descendants. Julian used his incredible memory to recount the specific details of their parents' lives and accidents, proving to them that their tragedies were actually executions. "We aren't just running," Julian declared. "We aren't going to be the ink in their book anymore. We are going to be the fire that burns the pages. Tonight, we don't just run. Tonight, we make them pay the interest on a century of stolen lives. Tonight, Blackwood learns that you cannot build a paradise on a foundation of corpses and expect the floor not to break. All of your ancestors deserve at least that." The death of Julian Morcant was a masterpiece of grim theatre. 2 days before the centennial ceremony, Barnaby raised the alarm, claiming the poor, sickly clerk had knocked over a lamp in a fevered fit. By the time Rector Halloway arrived at the central lodge, it was a hollowed-out shell of blackened stone. Barnaby stood amidst the smoke, soot-stained and clutching the brass-bound century ledger. On the charred bed frame lay a body, a nameless soul Barnaby had pulled from the potter's field and dressed in Julian's spare coat. Halloway didn't even look at the body. He simply took the ledger with a thin, satisfied smile. "The island has no more use for his breath," the rector whispered. "Only his ink." The night of the ceremony arrived under a sky the color of a bruised plum. The community hall was packed. 100 citizens stood in their white hoods, forming a perfect, faceless circle around the central altar. The rector stood at the heart of it, the ledger open, his silver pen ready to seal their prosperity for another 100 years. "A century of progress," Halloway cried, "witnessed and sealed." But as his pen touched the paper, the warm, incense-thick air hit the lunar ink. Before the rector's eyes, the black scrawl of 100 years of achievements began to shimmer and fade. The rows of data, the grain yields, the iron output evaporated into nothingness. A collective gasp of horror rippled through the hall, but the terror truly began when 4 words started to bleed through the vellum, dark, jagged, and mocking. "Memory never dies, Halloway." "What is this?" Halloway shrieked. "Where is our history?" The answer came in a series of thunderous roars. To the north, the grain silos erupted. To the south, the umbilicus bridge detonated, its stone spine snapping into the Atlantic. To the east and west, the patrol boats became floating pyres. Panic shattered the hall. The citizens reached the shoreline only to find their nightmare was complete. The bridge was gone. The boats were ash. In the distance, 5 small boats moved toward the mainland. In the lead boat, Barnaby pulled the oars while Julian stood tall, his jaundiced skin finally clearing in the salt air. Behind them, in 4 separate skiffs, sat the families of the smith, the miller, the healer, and the lawman. Julian looked back at the shore. He could see the rector and the villagers standing on the cliffs, their white hoods discarded, their faces twisted in a newfound genuine sorrow. They weren't angry anymore. They were pleading. "Wait!" The rector's voice drifted over the water, cracked and weeping. "Julian, please. We don't know how to plant. We don't know how to heal the fever. We've forgotten how the machines work. You can't leave us like this. We'll starve. We'll freeze in the dark." It was the pitiful cry of a people who had spent a century stealing the talent of others and had forgotten how to be human themselves. They stood on the edge of the abyss, begging the man they tried to murder to come back and save them from their own uselessness. Julian looked at the other 4 boats, at the families who finally owned their own futures. He didn't shout back. He simply watched as the fog began to swallow the island. "How will we live?" The cry came one last time, a sob of pure, helpless despair. Julian turned his back to the island and looked toward the mainland. "By the sweat of your own brows," he whispered to the wind, "just like the rest of us." As the 5 boats vanished into the grey, the only thing left of Blackwood was a ring of fire slowly dying in the middle of a cold, hungry sea. Blackwood was finally silent, and Julian Morcant was finally home. Thank you for listening. If this story stayed with you, you're always welcome back in the Silent Room. New stories every week. Until next time, take care.